Hi, curious friend. Welcome to Building Your Best Brain podcast. We are officially in a new era of the podcast. So if you're new here, welcome. If you've been following along, you may have just listened to my latest podcast episode with Dr. Lisa Riegel, all around perceptions in the brain. And before that, we focused on fear in the brain and the many aspects of fear, how it plays on your brain, and all that fun stuff. And that chapter, as I mentioned before, is over. And I'm excited to announce what we'll be focusing on this month, which is to introduce the science behind the inside out world. And what I mean by that is the idea that your external world, so the science behind how your external world responds or changes based off of your internal world, being your biology, being your brain, being your thoughts, beliefs, emotions, all that stuff. And it's not talked about enough. And I think it's because, one, it's not the most fun, right? Like when things are outside of our control, and especially when things that are unpleasant happen to us, it's much more comforting, or maybe not even comforting, but it's a lot easier to think, well, that happened and, I had no control over it. So I'm just going to let it go and hope it doesn't happen again. And then it happens again, usually. And the same kind of thing happens. And while in the immediate moment, it might feel great to be able to have that kind of, I don't know if escape is the right word, but be able to have that option of, I can't control my outside environment. I'm just going to let this go, chalk it up to a bad situation, a bad person, a bad event, not being lucky, versus seeing how maybe there were things internally happening at the level of how your brain was firing, at the level of where your body was operating at in terms of its stress response that maybe made that situation happen. And so this episode is not about, it's an introduction, right? So it's introducing this concept. And I'm going to deep dive, share some stories, introduce some of the science that we're going to dive into in later episodes. But it's really to wrap your head around that you have a lot more control than you think. And it's not a permission slip. You're never going to get this from me. A permission slip to beat yourself up of like, okay, so then everything that's bad that has happened to me is my fault, because that's not the case. But the idea here is that you are not at mercy to your external circumstance. And this is not something that is coming from the manifestation world where, you think, then you believe, and, you can create anything you want in your life. This is not coming from this place. It's coming from literal scientific evidence on how our brain operates and how other people, those external people you don't have control of, how their brains operate as well. And to dive into that, I just want you to absorb the stories I'm about to share. So I'm going to get a little personal and start to think of the scenarios, right? Like if you identify with these scenarios in specific or ones that are similar, if you can start attaching how I was operating internally versus what happened externally, and seeing how there is an interaction between the two, and that this is an empowering thing to know. This is not a devastating, annoying thing to know. And we're just here introducing it. We got all month, if not more, depending on your questions and curiosities, to dive into this. The first example I want to give of this introduction to the inside out world is me in my work. I feel like, work is very important to me, career is very important to me, knowledge, science, education, all of that is super important to me. So many of my stories come from this area. But after my master's, which if you guys have listened at all, and I'll link an episode below where I talk more about my master's story, and maybe I'll do like a deep dive podcast on it one day, was a crash out, burnout experience. And after this crash out, burnout experience, where I started exploring yoga, meditation, breath work, I got my yoga teacher training at the time and was starting to regulate myself in a way that was actually rewiring my brain to stay that way, which was really cool because I'd been in therapy for a super long time. And yes, there was definitely a ton of value in there and it did help. But I found that I really struggled once I stepped outside the therapist office to keep all of that kind of like groundedness and reassurance with me. I was working in a biotech company and at the time I was deciding between a PhD and a job, and I got this biotech job. And the first job I had in that company was really cool. I was a analytical coordinator, so it was an entry level position, but that helped me see a lot of the company, right? So I got to interact with a lot of really high up people. I got to interact with a lot of companies that were outside the company that we were having collaborations with, liaising with, had contracts with. And I loved it, learned a lot. And then at around the sixth, 7th month mark, I kind of knew where I wanted to go next. Like it was a really great way for me to see all the options that were available. And then I was like, okay, well, I've kind of plateaued learning here. And as you can tell, I'm doing my PhD right now. So this would have been, when did I start this job? It would have been 2019, if I remember correctly. Yeah, 2019. So it was before the pandemic. I had maybe like 6 or maybe even a full year in before the pandemic hit in 2020. And I'm doing my PhD now. So you can tell that learning and growing, especially mentally, is very important to me. And the company was incredible. They respected that. They saw my potential and they wanted me to grow with them. They didn't want me to leave the company, but I was really good at my position, even though I didn't like it in the end because it leaned on skills that I was good at, but it wasn't leaning on skills that I felt super fired up about and was kind of depleting my energy, which is a whole other topic. So they gave me a little side project, which was basically me answering my own scientific question and liaising with a scientist, a group from Switzerland. And they gave this to me to spearhead it and all this great stuff. And so when I got this little side project, I put quite a bit of pressure on myself to do the best job I possibly could because there was this element, and this is not something that the company designed. This is something that Sylvie, brought forward. This element of I had to prove myself. I had to show them that I was smart enough to do this, that I was capable to do this. This was the right decision, and that this would springboard them either creating a new position for me or letting me apply to scientist positions within the company. Needless to say, I did not approach that work thinking that I got this, or even just seeing that opportunity as a sign of, oh, they have confidence in me in doing this. Because if they didn't, then they wouldn't give it to me. That was definitely nowhere near my mind whatsoever. And this company, every month, we would take turns as a group giving presentations. And it was a way for individuals to share their work kind of with the broader audience. It wasn't the entire company, but it was an entire department. So we would have been, how many would we have been? Maybe less than 40 people, or maybe a bit more, 40, 50 people. And there would be two people presenting. And then the CTO at the time, the Chief Technical Officer, would be there to ask questions. And so I worked my tail off when it was my turn to present because I was presenting on this work. And I actually I gave this presentation more than once. And I remember the weekend before, because I think we were doing it Monday or Tuesday. I worked on it all weekend. I like till like midnight, right? Like just pouring everything I could into it, thinking of every question they could possibly ask me, and really just like all from the energy, right? I'm expending all of this energy from the energy that I need to prove myself. This is how I'm going to get the promotion I want. This is how I'm going to be able to get the job that I want. And this is just so important. And so when I gave this presentation, and this is something that I, for whatever reason, have been decently blessed in. And I think you guys can probably appreciate that because people that start podcasts are people that like to talk and have a facility for the gab. And so I, gave the presentation, and even though I was nervous and having this in the back of my mind of how important it was, it came across really well. Right? Like I wasn't fumbling my words, I wasn't stuttering. My slides were incredibly well put together, bonkers how well they were put together. And at the end of the presentation, it got opened up for questions. And there was one scientist who we were actually working on the same team. And he asked a question, but he asked a question and people, sorry, I think there's a truck going by. Hopefully the mic doesn't pick it up. People that are in academia, especially, or even people, I feel like everybody has this person at work. And it's not the person's fault. This is what I'm getting to. It's not the person's fault. But he asked the question like he already knew the answer, right? So you already know from the jump that this is not going to be a great situation. And he asked a question asking me if I controlled for a certain variable. And then said right after that he pulled this information from an expert that works in this established place who does this all the time for similar things. And this is what he said could be the problem. And I remember my stomach dropping, like my heart just dropping in my stomach, getting flush in the face. Like I was in a full-blown panic having this question, mainly because, and I remember I did answer it, but I got to tell you guys, I don't remember what my answer was. And that's because when we're in our fight or flight, like we're not depending on which type of stress we're not accessing our frontal lobe, right? Which will be able to help kind of filter the information to be able to pull the answers and like manipulate using our working memory. None of that was happening. I was in full-blown panic. I said some kind of answer and the call ended and I I remember I called my mom. I'm trying to think of how old I was. I would have been 25, 26. I called my mom. She's worked in a similar industry before. I'm like sobbing on the phone, thinking it's the end of the world. I have to give this presentation again, I think like 30 minutes later. And so I'm like wiping my face with cold water, like getting the ice cubes under the eyes, and luckily this was COVID time, so it was through Zoom. I did it again. That same person happened to be on the call again and said the question again. And I was so angry and so pissed off. And I remember basically the result of that, which is like lit almost everybody's worst nightmare was the work that I did for that project never within the company never got taken seriously because of that question. They never looked into it seriously. Um they didn't think it was worth their time basically. And the person's question was valid, but the work I did was valid too. And because I was coming from this place of like needing to prove myself and that this was going to be my launching pad to get the promotion and yada, 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 I couldn't even use my full brain to be able to communicate that during the call. And that person felt comfortable enough and asked their question and my answer and basically led to what I was really not hoping would happen, which was the little side project I got not being taken seriously whatsoever for literally months after. I remember my boss at the time, it's interesting. I did get the promotion, funnily enough, I did get the promotion and I got more projects, obviously, because I believe my role was like associate scientist or associate researcher, research associate. There we go. Um, she even said months later, I remember we were talking about the project and she's like, oh, well, so and so said that we can't really use that data. And I was the lead of the project. I was the one closest to it, right? And still, that event had that kind of impact that even months after, even, when I got promoted, that I was still in that particular project not taken seriously. Now, now you're thinking, how is the inside outside linked? How is it that the way that you approach the presentation, the thoughts, beliefs, emotions you had before the presentation, how did it impact what happened on the outside? Wouldn't that happen regardless because that person is the way that person is and it has nothing to do with you? Well, this leads to my other story. And this leads to my PhD. I had the opportunity almost 3 years ago now, 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, to go to Japan. To go to Japan to do this kind of symposium training, and a part of it was to give a presentation. Now, this work I do in my PhD was very different than what I did in my master's, very different than what I did at the biotech company I worked at. So I had no additional experience or expertise in the topic that I was going to be presenting. So that's not a factor here at all. But the big difference is that I worked on the presentation like a normal person. And I say that with so much love to myself and not shaming myself for not being normal because we all have unique gifts and traits and quirks and flaws, if we want to even call them that. But, I worked on it with my supervisor. I got to a point where I was like, you know what, it's done. I refreshed on some papers. I wrote up some questions that people may ask. But throughout it, I was like, you know what? You simply need to know what you know. You need to be rooted to what you know. And if things come up, if people ask questions and you don't know the answer, that is fine. You just say you don't know. There's nothing wrong with not knowing. That's fine, especially if you're rooted to what you do know, what you have accrued as knowledge, what you do feel comfortable sharing. I give this presentation, and in Japan, they're extremely timely. The schedules are so tight, and this is both a blessing and a nightmare if you are in academia and you're giving a presentation, because some people also have the gift of the gab in that space and will talk over. And it was pretty funny because you had the screen where you had your presentation, then you had the screen that was the timer. And it was green, counting down from when you started. And then once you reach the 3 minute mark, the numbers turned yellow. And then when it was zero, it turned red. And a horn, like a sound would go on. And then it would start counting upwards of like how much time you were over. So needless to say, I understand the intention behind that, and I find it hilarious because most academics from North America would never even dream of doing something like that. But it definitely added a bit of pressure to be on your stuff. And so I gave the presentation. Again, slides looked good. I knew my stuff, and I was simply there sharing what I know. And that was the energy that I was coming from. Those were the thoughts that I was having was, I'm here to share what I've done. I'm here to share what I've known. And the questions that came up were great. And it was a lot of positive feedback about the work I'd been doing, a lot of interest, a lot of interesting questions. And then one person, similar, but not quite the same annoying energy. But it's hard to say if maybe this person does have the same annoying energy, but I was in such a different place that I didn't interpret it that way. So wild how our brains work. He asked a question, also knowing the answer. And he knew the answer because, I study this really specific part of a cell in the brain. I study astrocytes and I study this little organelle called the primary cilia. And in the brain, in the adult brain, we don't know a lot about it. So I've been focusing all of my research and papers on what we do know about it in the brain, both in development and adulthood. And this person knew about it from kidney studies and asked me if I looked at a specific protein and if it was expressed in astrocytes. And I had no idea that this protein was expressed in this organelle at all. And that is exactly what I said. I said, well, based off of, and again, me rooting to what I already know, based off of all the studies from the adult nervous system and development, this has not been identified in this group of cells. And then he suggested a really cool experiment we could try. And my supervisor was there too, right? So there could have been a version of me that was embarrassed that my supervisor was there and I wasn't able to answer a question related to my project. But what ended up happening was it spun off a new connection for the lab. This professor, I think a few hours after my presentation, emailed me and my supervisor with the papers that he was referring to and basically had this open door of, if you ever want to explore this, let us know. We would love to help contribute to this work. So talk about a pretty similar thing happening with a completely different outcome. One outcome being we're discrediting all the work you've done based off of a question that you didn't know how to answer versus not knowing how to answer a question and getting told that your work is great. We believe in your work so much that we want to do some work for you. And yeah, sending additional resources your way because that is how much we believe in what you're doing. And a huge part that is different between those two stories is how I felt about myself in relationship to what I was presenting. One was in the energy of that I have to do this perfectly so that I can get the job I want. If I don't get the job I want, then I'm stupid, I'm not good enough. Versus I'm simply here to share what I know and what I know well. To be able to collaborate, discuss, brainstorm. Nothing about whether I needed to prove myself, nothing about whether I wanted people to think that I was smart or not. I genuinely did not care. Why? Because I am smart. I'm smart in the way that I am smart, which might sound like a really silly sentence, but we're all smart in different ways. And I own how I learn things. I own how I absorb information. And I'm also somebody that likes to bite on a little more than she can chew. I like to stretch that way. That's how I learn, and that's how I learn profoundly and quickly is to fall. And now I'm learning, you can be rooted to yourself this way, and that has way more of a role when it comes to how the world is responding to you externally versus having everything perfect on paper and just being perfect in general, right? Trying to be perfect is like a recipe to have the world hand your butt over. Now, I want to share another story because you may be thinking, okay, Sylvie, so I sort of buy this idea of, the inside narrative, feelings, emotions, thoughts, how that could play a role in the external. But it's still two different circumstances, right? I mean, one, you're in industry, the other one, you're in academia. In one, you're 26, and the other one, you're 30. Like, could there be other variables at play? Great question. This is where I bring in a story about my partner. So, same variable, a much shorter time frame as well, but a disclaimer is that my partner is a wonderful human being. So this is not he's a something hole, because he's not. He's great. And this is because he's so great, right? And a good person and a kind person. It also adds to the story around how inside out this world is, how he was simply reflecting what I was feeling on the inside, whether he was aware of it or not. So, as some of you may know, I started a business in August where I use neurofeedback, which is these little at-home EEG devices to help train the brain into different states. And so I paired these with meditation, and there's the whole Fire and Rewire program where we basically focus on rewiring your most stubborn circuits so that you can live your life to the fullest, right? Have the energy you want, the cognitive space, the ability to regulate your stress, all that good stuff. And the way this journey started was, I did a neurofeedback training. Again, neurofeedback's a technique where you can learn how to train your brain in real time. So your brain wave will synchronize with music that you're listening to on your phone through an app on your phone. So when your brain wave increases, the music increases, and you know in real time how to manipulate your brain wave. Through that training, I was in contact with two companies, and they were very excited about the work that I was doing. They were excited about my background. They were excited that I was using this technology to help people deepen their meditation practice, help people regulate their stress in a meaningful way. And I was telling this to my partner, and this would have been maybe in June, May or June. We were up to the cottage and we were walking, and I was saying how I had these contracts with these two companies, right? Where they were paying me to create content about the technique, the hardware, the software, all that good stuff. And it meant a lot to me, right? It meant a lot to me because, they obviously believed something in me, and they saw that what I was doing was of value. And when I was sharing this with my partner, I was in the process of figuring out how to use this technology paired with all my experience, paired with all my education, to be able to craft an offering, a service to really help people. And honestly, at that time, I was still very much brainstorming. I wasn't super rooted to how I would bring it all together. Meditation is a huge part of my story. It's a huge part of how I've been able to get to where I am in life. And pairing it with neurofeedback seemed like a really great way to marry my neuroscience expertise with my lived experience. But I wasn't sure how it was all going to shake out yet. And his response, as I was telling him about these contracts that I got and, how excited I was and how it seems really hopeful and fruitful for my future business that, that year I've been brainstorming for quite a while because I've been doing Synaptic Sylvie for a while. And I was like, how do I help people with all this knowledge that I have? How do I translate that into something that's real and tangible? He, sorry, he surface level was not very supportive. And it wasn't that he wasn't supportive of me getting the contracts. He's like, yeah, that's cool. That's interesting. But, like we're building a life together. And is your plan for a business to create content on the internet? And he was like, and is your plan to just live contract to contract? Like, we want to get a house together. We want to build a family together. And I'll never forget these words. And I'm not triggered by them because I know this inside out rule, which again is one of the benefits of knowing this scientific concept. But he was literally like, I would kill myself if I had to work contract to contract. And so, needless to say, he like shut this idea down. He kind of crushed me a little bit. And because I knew this concept already, I went, okay, so why did he crush me on something that's honestly seemingly kind of positive, right? Positive in the sense that, I'm going to get more money. I have these contracts. I'm building, I'm networking, right? I'm networking with people that are high up in the field. Like these are all great things that he's just like, wah, wah, not great. And I said, okay, well, what am I like? How am I feeling about this area of life? And the truth was I was feeling like I was holding back a bit, that I was kind of hiding behind these contracts and not fully putting myself out there in what I just described, right? And offering a service where I really marry my expertise with the technology to help give people the transformation that I experienced in a way faster timeline. Like this technology really does speed things up in so many ways, and that's not the point of this episode. And I kind of knew what I wanted to give, right? Which is now the Fire and Rewire program. But I was holding back, kind of being like, okay, well, let me do this contracts. Let me, share this on social media slowly. And so there's an element of me hiding that he picked up on. He picked up on the fact that I wasn't totally rooted to what I was saying and called me out in a way that he probably wasn't even aware of. And I know this because in August, so a few months later, I put the program out there. I put the program out there. People started signing up. I started working with people one on one. And I knew right away that this is what I was supposed to do the whole time. And it actually gets me a little emotional talking about it. So if you guys have the pleasure, or maybe not the pleasure, of seeing the video version of this, luckily or maybe not luckily, but luckily I'm getting a new webcam that's really gonna take this podcast to the next level. So you might not be able to see my eyes watering through my MacBook webcam, but they are. I knew that I was in the right place, that my skills, my expertise, my unique traits that just make me Sylvie, because you have unique traits too that just make you you, and they were all being used in putting this Fire and Rewire program together. And people are experiencing really great shifts from it. And I remember in the beginning stages of this, he asked me how it was going because I decided that I wasn't going to tell him. After that, I was like, like the next time I tell him anything about my business, I'm going to have to be so rooted to it because I'm just going to get garbage. Not garbage, but I'm just going to get reflected back to me that I'm not rooted to it. And he brought it up one day, and I told him how it was going and who I was seeing, what they were experiencing. And, he asked me about the pricing and how many people I worked with and what they were sharing with me. And he was blown away, truly blown away, so supportive. He, and this really would have been like less than 6 months since the I would kill myself if I lived contract to contract. That's always going to make me laugh. He was looking up other people that were doing this, which nobody's doing exactly what I'm doing, which is really cool. And he was coming up with all these ideas for like campaigns and slogans. And he even went into ChatGPT and put in my price rates to figure out like how many clients would I have to see to have this level of income. And he's been on my butt to get an official website up, which he's totally right. But to go from somebody that is literally creating a business plan for you, pushing you every day to get your website online because he believes in your business so much, versus I would die if I had to live contract to contract. Don't we want to start a family? How are you going to be able to support yourself? The difference, because it's the same guy, it's the same relationship. It's how rooted I was to what I have to offer this world, rooted to my business. And that is where the inside out part comes in. And so, an analogy that I like to use is that the world is mirrors, right? So, those people asking me questions when I was in biotech, when I was in my PhD, they were mirrors to how I was doing internally. My partner, constantly, constantly a mirror to how I am doing. And so if I don't like what I'm seeing, and this is again, not to beat yourself up, this is empowering. If I don't like what I'm seeing, then it's something inside, calling to something inside that is being active in my brain, that is being active in my body. And I want us to wrap our minds around this, because if we don't wrap our minds around this, I can give you all the science in the world and you're not going to believe it. And belief is a huge, huge component to having the tools, the knowledge, having any of it work. And that's why Building Your Best Brain podcast exists, because I give you the science to help with the belief. But it's also important that you see this in your everyday life to have the belief as well. It's not enough to just know the the neuroscience, the cellular mechanisms, the chemicals that are floating around in your body when this happens. It helps, but it is super important to also know that where it's happening in your life. And so in terms of some of the science that you're going to have to look forward to in the next episodes, because there's a lot of cool stuff emerging, and most of it is in the realm of neuroscience. So a lot of it looks at brainwave activity, looking at different regions that light up, looking at how brainwave activity can synchronize with other people, right? So it's that inside out world. We'll also focus on a really special group of cells called mirror neurons. And mirror neurons are active when you see somebody doing something. Your activity will match up. And this has been studied a lot in the context of motor movement, but mirror neurons are everywhere in the brain. And we'll get more details on that when we cross that episode. Even when it comes down to your stress response, there are studies that look at, and again, we're going to go way, way deeper in the next couple episodes, right? But looking at, the tone of your voice, being able to measure cortisol levels between people. Pheromones we might look into. Pheromones in human studies, there's not a ton of them, but I want to look to see if there's any new cutting edge things as well in terms of what you're emitting, how other people are responding. Before we get there with all the science, all the deep dives, I want you to reflect on how this is true in your life. How has the inside out world concept happened to you? And a great place to start is to look at things that you do repeatedly. For example, if you have a partner in your life or if you have kids in your life, that's a great example, right? You interact with them a lot and you interact with them over similar things, right? Whether it's date night or sitting at the dinner table or taking them to soccer practice, right? You have those kind of repeated events with the same person. Or you can think about work, for example, if there are common meetings that you have every week or common tasks that you have to do with other people. Looking at those repeated things and picking examples that are extreme, right? So, kind of thinking of the best time you had date night with your partner versus the worst time you had date night with your partner, and do a little internal reflection of, what was going on with you that week? What were you thinking that week? What were you feeling that week? How did you think and feel right before you went out on that date? To just basically give yourself a bit of evidence, give your brain some stuff to chew on how this applies to your life. And then we'll dive into all the nitty-gritty components of when it comes to the inside out world and dive into some of the studies and some of the science fundamentals around this. But again, most important, being able to figure out how this is happening in your life a little bit before we dive into the science of it. And a great way to start diving into this is to join my Pick My Brain webinar. This is a webinar that I do that is completely free every week, where we basically dive a little deeper on the topics of the podcast. And when I mean dive a little deeper, I mean focus on the applications. So people come in with, questions on anything they maybe don't fully understand or they want a new lens on. They may come with a particular situation that they're looking to get some guidance on, or maybe they've tried some of the stuff that we've talked about in the podcast and it's working, but maybe not working to the level that they were anticipating or hoping, and we can make some small tweaks together. But in order to be able to have access to these webinars, which of course you have access to replays if you register, you do have to hop onto my email list. So I'll leave a link in the show notes if that's something that's interesting to you, because again, listening to this is a huge part of it, right? So if you're here roughly an hour, incredible. I know you're somebody that is not surface level, that wants to dive deep, and that wants to be empowered and not told what to do, or you know what I mean? Like, I know you guys are very motivated, smart, capable people that come onto this podcast. And so this webinar is really strictly to help answer questions, to help you apply this more effectively in your life, because everybody's life's different, everybody's background's different, and it's hard to know, right, what's going to work and what's not going to work and what is really best for you. So I'll leave that in the show notes. And thank you so much for your time and attention. I am stoked to dive into the next episode with this. And with that, I will see you guys next week. Take care.